And say yes. Yeah. When I say exact again, I am using precise language. All right. Okay. Okay. I did not say tank at the same time. I said tank. Okay. So if that were the true, I would be whoa. I'm already whoa. But anyway. So la. First of all, your entrance test. If you were apportioning blame, okay, for the failure of the passage of the Treaty of Versailles, how would you apportion said blame? Well, who are you going to blame? Who are you going to blame? Come on, there's less people here. It should be less threatening. We're kind of cozy and just hanging out. Yeah.
I would blame the Republicans because they attacked the treaty for the Article 10, which basically stated that like an attack on one is an attack on all. So it took the power to declare war away from Congress. So they were the troublemakers in the whole process.
They were the troublemakers in the whole okay, blame the Republicans. And I've heard that before. Right.
Wait, in real quick, we answer it like why it failed instead of like who's the blame?
If you would like to play it that way, play it that way.
Okay, the Treaty of Versailles failed to pass the United States because after getting involved in European affairs and suffering losses from the World War, America began to lean toward isolationist policies. So Congress, dominated by Republicans, who were already inclined to reject the Democratic president's treaty terms, rejected the treaty in order to distance itself from war-torn Europe and focus on internal unification.
Well played. Well played. So well that I think we can flip to the warm-up. So now going back to the war. What role did the United States play in resolving World War I? What was its role? What was its role? What did it do? How did it help end this thing? What's that? They were like the tipping point. Okay, give it one example as to how. It was a good answer, but give one example as to how.
They
You want to phone a friend?
yeah, can I phone a friend?
All right. So
Potato.
okay. So why is the United States kind of the tipping point as far as ending this thing?
Because the not really sure.
Lifeline? Okay, lifeline. All right.
Because they were the ones manufacturing a lot of like the stuff that the other countries needed, and they were favoring like Britain and France. So the other countries that they were like against knew that they couldn't beat Britain and France and the U.S. like all aligned.
Okay, awesome. Well done. Okay. You've answered, so we're going to hold on you. Yeah.
I think the actual physical appearance of the U.S. troops in Europe also played a role because by that time European cars were all worn out, and then U.S. was coming in fashion.
Yeah, all fresh. Yeah, it's so fresh, so clean. And then one last thing. So the stuff, the people, and then there's one last thing that's really, really important. Yeah.
Fear of the U.S. military?
It would be fair to the U.S. So we're there, and there's this fear because the United States has this unlimited troop supply. There's one other thing besides stuff and besides manufactured stuff and troops. There's one other thing: food. Okay, the food. Being able to basically feed one side, and what the reason why I want to truly draw your attention to that is because that is what the Germans did not have. The food that they did have, they were sending it to their troops so their troops could eat. So therefore, what was happening back at home? Starvation. And so your troops are losing their will to fight, and back home people are starving. Does this sound like a country that was going to continue to fight for much longer? And the answer was no. Okay. So, all right, you guys, well done. Okay, so let's keep it up today with our more cozy thing. Feel free to answer things. Okay. Okay, so everybody get the next little bit. We're taking this out a little chunk at a time. So this is your second nibble of chapter 20 is, pardon me, 23, or 22, one more time. 718 through 730, okay? It's all up here. I saw some people taking pictures of so they could have it all on one page. It is also up on Schoology. It's all up on Schoology, so yeah.
Isn't it correct that Germany's still paying off war debts to us?
They are, let's see, this debt, Germany I think is done with us, but they're not done with everybody else. We restructured their debt years ago to make it so that they could.
Didn't they just finish paying it off last year?
Yeah, it's recent. Yeah.
Oh, I think Mr. Bird told us last year was like 2005.
Yeah, so it's like, recent though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was in Academics Capcom last year, and the theme last year was World War I.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it said that Germany finished paying off its war debts in 2014.
In 2004. Okay, so I guess the thing is, sounds like it's around now. Okay, but no matter what, wow, right? Okay. So for our next little chunk, it's we're moving on to chapter 22. Really, the way this unit goes is we have a war chapter, which was chapter 21. We have a party chapter, which is chapter 22. We have a depressing chapter, which is chapter 24. And then we have a war chapter, which is chapter 25. So it's war, party, depression, war. Okay? Which is kind of like how they named this chapter, cultural conflict, bubble, and bust. That's mine better. So, we start with a thought. Okay, so this is a thought. World War I basically had a huge effect on the United States and our kind of the way we look at one another. Okay, it did create like these differences that existed in the United States, but for some reason, before the war, we weren't so much looking at them, but afterwards we were. Okay, it kind of did a spotlight on the differences that were developing in American society, and it will help ignite something we call a culture war, which in many ways is still being fought to this day. And so the scary but cool thing about what we're going to start talking about is that you're going to recognize things. It's not going to be Alexander Hamilton versus Thomas Jefferson and how stretchy the Constitution should ought to be. It's going to be about issues that you recognize and you understand. And if it's not something that is that close and personal to you, it might be something that was close and personal to your parents or your grandparents. It's not far, far away stuff anymore. We are now reaching stuff that we know in our lives today. So with that buildup, okay, almost as if it were out of last year's newspapers. The first issue I want to talk about is racial strife. Okay. Now, how World War I, what World War I does here is it created something that was different. So think of after the Civil War, you had kind of same. And what the same was is that you had the development of these Southern Democratic Party governments that would put in place Jim Crow laws and voter laws that basically turned African Americans into second-class citizens in the South. But World War I changes them. And two ways that that World War I changes what had kind of developed into a kind of continuing type of thing in African American society was that one, people are going to go serve. Okay, some 350,000 African Americans will go serve in the United States military. Now they served in segregated units. But over there, people were treated, well, people kind of treated African American soldiers over there the same way they treated white soldiers over there. Kind of the same. And so you've gone over and you have served your country, you've done this thing, okay, and you feel pretty good about yourself, right? And so then you go home to Mississippi. And when you go home to Mississippi, you have kind of this sense of self, okay, that's a little bit different than maybe when you left. When you left, okay, the attitude would be that you have to be deferential, okay? Let's say you were walking down the street and you see a white couple walking towards you. What would be the thing to do? Would be basically step off the sidewalk, let them walk by, maybe stare at your shoes while they walk by. But now, okay, you feel a little bit better, but you bet yourself you're not into that zone. And these people come walking towards you, and you look them straight in the eye, and maybe smile. Similarly, the war is going to transform society by offering to many people, but particularly African Americans, an opportunity to do jobs that had maybe been forbidden before. But why are they not forbidden now? Because workers were necessary. Okay, we are desperate to build the boom boom stuff during the war, and so since we're desperate, okay, basically what will happen in the workplace is A, jobs that had never really been available to African Americans are available, and B, people are being treated far more equitably than they ever had been before. Okay. But then the war ends. And what happens when the war ends is reaction. Okay? The jobs are not so much available anymore. Okay? You have a whole bunch of soldiers returning, white soldiers returning, and those would be the people who will want their jobs back. Okay? And there are fewer jobs because we don't need to make the boom boom stuff anymore. And so what will start to happen is that people will face discrimination. Okay, the slightest insult or trifle will result in a race riot. And that guy who was walking down the street and didn't and wasn't deferential and didn't step off the sidewalk and didn't stare at his shoes, well, what will happen to him is that night someone is going to pound on his door, kick it in, drag him out into the night, and lynch him at the nearest poplar tree. Lynching became an epidemic in the United States. In 1919 alone, we have a reported national death toll of some 120 people just simply being taken and lynched. And let's just say that given that many of these crimes were committed in rural areas where a lot of people don't talk, the number is probably much higher than this. Okay? In places like Tulsa, Oklahoma, okay? During the war, because of manufacturing, there had developed a district where there was kind of a middle class developing among African Americans. Well, a small incident is going to lead to a riot in which whites will attack this middle class neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and burn 35 square blocks of it. Dozens of people will be killed. The lynching. This lynching was done so often that an underground trade began, where people would actually take photographs of the people who were lynched and turn them into postcards. And people would trade the postcards. What will become the big civil rights issue for African Americans in the 1920s. Now, yes, equal rights was a thing that people wanted, but the biggest issue, the biggest thing that people started going out and holding up signs and demanding was a federal anti-lynching law. And the reason why they wanted a federal anti-lynching law was because in those rural counties and whatnot, when someone got lynched, who was in charge of the law enforcement? Okay, a white Southerner, okay, a white Southern sheriff, who was probably a member of the Ku Klux Klan. That white sheriff was not going to hunt down the people who did the lynching. It just wasn't going to happen. The federal government had absolutely no say in who got prosecuted for things like murder. Okay? When the United States government removed its troops from the South in 1877, the Posse Comitatus Act was passed, which basically disallowed federal intervention in basically state affairs of this type. And so the only way you could bring the federal government into this lynching situation is to basically declare the act of lynching to be a separate federal crime, in effect violating someone's civil rights, in order for the federal government to get involved. Otherwise, it's a local matter, and the local was not going to do anything about it. Period. The other major change we saw after, after World War I was really against workers in general. Okay? You see, after the war, or let's flip back. During the war, union power increases, right? Because if you're a company and you need workers, and you basically, as a laborer, say, oh, if you want me, you're gonna have to pay me more. And the business says, yeah, we need you, so we'll pay you more. Okay, and then you say, well, if you need me, I want a union. And the union, and the company goes, yeah, okay, we need you, so you can have a union. Well, the war's over. And what had been a labor shortage turns into a labor glut. As A, the amount of manufacturing goes down, so fewer jobs. B, you have soldiers returning home from the war. That means more workers. And so, what ends up happening is you shift from advantage labor to advantage employer. And what the employer will start to do is pay cuts. What the employer will do is, when the opportunity arrives, root out those unions. Okay, make it so that they don't recognize. And how can they do this? Well, because they now have the upper hand. Right.
So after the war, did the U.S. just like not keep building up an army?
Yeah.
They just go back.
Yeah,
to
the simple answer is we went off onto the world stage with an army, didn't like it, so let's do the opposite and not have a big army again.
So if we had kept the big army, would these people? Do you think?
Not necessarily, because remember you were building up for an actual war thing. We're manufacturing things not only for ourselves but for our allies as well. And simply, you're not blowing up the bombs anymore. You don't need to make as many of them.
Okay.
Okay. Anyway, the reaction among workers is utter chaos. We are going to have some 4 million Americans go out on strike in 1919. Okay, so labor strike after labor strike after labor strike after labor strike. Imagine picking up the newspapers and seeing, oh my God, another labor strike. Well, first thing here, I'm going to talk about it a little bit later, but what had happened in Russia in 1917?
All the communists.
The communists. And when we think communists, what group do you think of? Who do you think of?
Foreigners.
Well, you think of foreigners, but if Bolsheviks, but what class of people supposedly is supposed to start? What's that? Who is supposed to unite because they have nothing to lose but their chains? One more time? Workers. Workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains, right? And now the workers are all going out on strike. Oh my God. You know what this might mean? Communism. Okay? So we'll talk more about what that is later. But I want to draw your attention to these 4 million people all out on strike, all in 1919. Now the employers are going to use several ways to try and break these strikes. But their most successful method is the old divide and conquer method. What they're going to do is they're going to hire strikebreakers, they're going to hire scabs. But when they do it, they're going to hire people by particular ethnic groups. So they're going to basically hire, okay, a whole bunch of Mexican strikebreakers, or a whole bunch of African American strikebreakers. Okay, so now think about it. You are the person who was out on strike, and your strike is being broken by this group. What just happened? Are you thinking, oh my God, the business is crushing my strike? Or are you looking at who the strikebreakers are and perhaps their ethnicity? Yeah. And so what ends up happening is you just start breaking up the labor movement by ethnic group and pitting one ethnic group against another, okay, and losing the uniting factor of everybody's a worker, if that makes sense. The employers will basically then, after they break a strike, they will transform what had been a union job into a non-union job. And when it's a non-union job, it means that it's going to be less pay, worse hours, worse working conditions. This anti-union attitude also hit what we call the public sector. Now these are terms, these are kind of economic terms. Let's make sure you know them. When you say private sector, you're thinking of corporations, okay? When you say public sector, you're talking about people that are, in effect, employees of the government in some way. So it could be police officers, it could be firemen, it could be teachers, okay? Public employees. Now, in 1919, the Boston Police Department wants to form a union. And so to establish their union, or to get their union recognized, they're going to go out on strike. Well, the governor of Massachusetts was a guy by the name of Calvin Coolidge. What Calvin Coolidge is going to say is that there is no right to strike against public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime. And so since there is no public, there's no public employee right to strike if it endangers public safety, what Calvin Coolidge is going to do is he's going to fire the entire Boston Police Department. Okay? You're all gone. Hire some other Irish guys to be the cops. Okay? And what this does is it will transform Calvin Coolidge into a folk hero, particularly among Republicans. And he will be named the Republican vice presidential candidate. Okay. The Supreme Court also gets into the act of lessening or eroding labor rights. The court is going to shift to be a more conservative one during the 1920s. This is particularly true when former President William Howard Taft is named Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. The best case, however, that you can use as an exemplar for this erosion of worker rights is a case called Adkins versus Children's Hospital. What this case did in one fell swoop is it, A, is going to reduce child protection in the workplace as far as child worker rights. And two, it took away a wage protection that had been put in place legally for women. Okay, there had been a huge gender gap in wages, and there was a case called Miller versus Oregon, which had sought to create some sort of stability for women's wages. Well, in the Atkins case, it was argued that since women now had the right to vote, they no longer needed this special protection for their wages. As labor unions lose power, there is now a vacuum. Okay? And what will happen, and okay, in math, you guys got, remember, you know the always, sometimes, never thing? Okay, so this is sometimes. This is not an always, this is not a never, this is a sometimes thing, okay? What some companies did is they decided that they needed to now be responsible for worker welfare. So in other words, if workers don't have unions and things like that, then it's the company's obligation to do something. And so what these companies will do is they will practice what we sometimes call welfare capitalism, where it's the employer taking responsibility for workers' well-being, doing things like offering health care, health insurance. And why would they do that? Well, what worker can come to work? The healthy one. Okay? So there's two different attitudes. Okay, so remember, this is a sometimes thing. So some employers go, the employee is a commodity, and if they can't show up at work, well, I'll just get another one. Okay? Other employers go, well, I've trained this worker. Okay, this worker is part of the working process of my company. It's in my interest to have this person continue. So I'm going to offer health care so that they can remain on the job more healthfully. Does that make sense? So it's a sometimes thing. Some companies obviously still were, you're a commodity, I don't care. But others did take this attitude. Another example of this was, in a sort of way, was Henry Ford. Henry Ford figured something out. Yes, I could pay you the least possible wage I could possibly pay you. Ricardo's iron law of wages, how low can I go? I could do that. But I'm not. Because you see, I sell automobiles. And I need people to buy my automobiles. And do I want to only market my automobile to the very few wealthy people? Or can I A, design a cheaper automobile, and then B, sell it, okay, possibly to a worker? And the only way that that worker would ever be able to afford to get my automobile, if I paid them more. Does that make sense? Okay. Basically, what you start to get with some companies is the idea that you need to boost wages because those workers are now the people buying your stuff. And if they can't afford to buy your stuff, you don't sell stuff and you don't make the money. Get it? Well, remember when I told you in 1919 there were 4 million workers all out on strike at various times. All through the newspapers there are these stories of strike, 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 strike. Well, it was not a huge, huge, huge leap for some people to take all of this labor unrest and basically think, oh, wait a minute. Marxism. Workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your change. Oh my God, communism. Maybe that's how it started there. All those strikes in Russia, and then they had themselves a Bolshevik revolution. Oh my God, we're going to have one here. The Bolsheviks are coming. OMG. All right? And so there's this fear out there, right? Fear. Well, making that fear a little bit more of a reality. In April of 1919, postal workers are going to find 34 mail bombs that had been directed toward public officials. And so people start doing the leap thing, because people do that. They go, oh my God, this is the next step. First it was the strikes, now they're attacking the government, OMG. It's begun, the revolution, oh. Now, the Attorney General of the United States was a guy by the name of A. Mitchell Palmer. And after the April incident, he says, oh, calm down. Nothing really happening here. Okay? But in June, a bomb blows up in front of his house. And the guy who in April said there is nothing to fear, in June becomes the guy who says, we have everything to fear! It's starting, people! Oh, it's upon us! We must do something! They're the Reds, they're on their way! How can we stop them? Communists are everywhere! They're under the bed, they're in the kitchen, they're under the... Okay. And A. Mitchell Palmer is given unusual ability to kind of trumpet this belief. Did someone blame a stroke for problems we had earlier? Okay. The stroke. Wilson is incapacitated. Wilson can say nothing as President of the United States. And so who is given much more, a bigger share of the public stage than he probably should have had was A. Mitchell Palmer. And so A. Mitchell Palmer is basically out there screaming, the sky is falling. Okay? And there's nobody to say anything different. A. Mitchell Palmer will begin what we call, very cleverly, the Palmer raids. What he does is he starts basically rounding people up merely on the old guilt by association thing. Are you a member of a communist party? Are you a member of a socialist party? Are you a member of the industrial workers of the world? Then you have radical tendencies and we suspect you of something. He made some 6,000 arrests. Okay, I used rounded up last when I first wrote it, and I switched it to arrested because that's truly what happened. But I left it up. I'm sorry. Now, when he made his arrests, many of the people he arrested were new immigrants to the United States. And if you were a new immigrant to the United States and you did not have citizenship, and he suspected you of being a radical, red, possibly ready to take down the government person, he deported you. The United States at that point will deport some 500 people. On what basis? Guilt by association. You were associated with socialism, you were associated with anarchism, you were associated with communism. That was enough. At one point, A. Mitchell Palmer had so many people that he was ready to deport that he put them all on board one big ship. It was called the USS Buford. And people started nicknaming this ship the Red Ark. The Red Ark. Anyway. The Red Scare is going to kind of end similarly to its beginning, okay? What A. Mitchell Palmer is going to do is he's going to say, I have information that on day there is going to be a huge flurry of bombs, mail bombs, bombs. There's going to be a big bombing campaign. The bombers are coming. Bombs, bombs, bombs. We'll call it Bomb Day. Bomb Day is coming, okay? Bomb Day didn't happen. And since basically he had predicted all sorts of bad things, and bad things didn't happen, well, he turned into, well, Chicken Little. Okay? The sky is falling. The effect, however, were huge, okay? Three basic things happened. First of all, labor unions. Remember how I told you that business was looking for ways to kind of crush labor unions at this point? Well, here's another way. You associate the labor union with Reds, socialism, communism, and you basically can destroy them. Most particularly, the industrial workers of the world is completely decimated by the Red Scare. Secondly, we basically lose the Socialist Party. It still kind of exists. Eugene V. Debs will run for president while in prison in 1920. But people just running as socialists and being elected to office kind of stops from this point. In New York, there were several members of the New York State Assembly who had been elected, as socialists. We had socialists serving in the New York State Assembly. In the New York State Assembly, they simply voted, you can go now. They dismissed all the socialist members of the New York State Assembly. And basically the message comes out, if you want to be in politics, can you be a socialist? No. I mean, even Bernie Sanders today, he calls himself what? An independent, not a socialist. The final, the final effect was in legal cases. What starts to happen is that when people were being accused of crimes, rather than proving that they actually did the crime, what would be brought up to the juries is that they're radical, socialist, communist connections. The most famous case was the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. Now, here's the thing. These two guys are very, very possibly guilty of murder here. Very possibly. Okay? But that's not the point. What the point is that the case that was made against them was a very persuasive case that they were communists, radicals, anarchists. That's the evidence that was used to convict them. Okay? In 1927, an appeals judge heard their appeal. They demanded a new trial because they believed that no one had actually proven that they had killed anybody. Okay? Because that's not the case that was put up. And the appeals judge basically said, no, the death sentence should be carried out. And they were put to death. Now again, they were very possibly guilty of murder. But it's not the case that was made. They were in effect put to death for being radical red sympathizers. Get it? That's it. Not a break, but let's do a pause, because that was kind of some heavy stuff. I probably should have put a question here, but I didn't. So let's just kind of stretch for a moment. Okay. So take a deep breath in. That was some heavy stuff, right, to get started? Okay. We're now going to shift gears into politics, and where I want to start in politics is a group that kind of had leaped onto the political stage in the 1920s. And that were, of course, women. Okay? Why all of a sudden women on the political stage? Because in 1919, women have the constitutional right to vote. Now, at first, there was a belief that women would vote together as a huge, powerful woman voting bloc. And so just now think about it, okay? If every, woman voted the same way, how powerful that voting voice would be. Okay? And so people kind of thought that that's what was going to happen. And politicians kind of took notice to many demands that women were making because they knew that there was that powerful vote thing out there. And so the attitude in the very beginning of the 1920s was that because women had been so active in bringing about the progressive era, that the progressive era would continue because of this powerful voting bloc. So, what we're going to see in the early 1920s is an organization called the Women's Joint Congressional Committee. Now, what it basically is think of it like an interest group. This group is going to seek to influence politicians to pass laws that were particularly beneficial to women. One of the laws that this committee will sponsor and get politicians to pass was a law known as the Shepherd-Towner Federal Maternity and Infancy Act of 1921. Okay? What it does is pretty much right there for you. What it is truly the first federally funded health care law. Okay? Pre-Obamacare. It passes largely because of this belief of this powerful women voting group. Got it? Now, another example of this is the National Women's Party, led by a woman by the name of Alice Paul, are going to call for something known as the ERA. And I know that baseball people over here are probably thinking, wait, earned run average? No. Okay. What this means, what this means is the Equal Rights Amendment. So when women got the right to vote, did they get absolute equality in American society? And the answer was absolutely not. And so what Alice Paul was calling for was no, we need to now put it in the Constitution. Full legal equality for women. The ERA, however, was blocked in the 1920s. When people began to argue that laws that had been put into place to protect women, okay, wages or working condition laws that had expressly stated things about gender in them, would be threatened. That these laws would go away if there were an Equal Rights Amendment. Now, by the way, the ERA does make a return in the 1970s. The 1970s, when the ERA comes back, it will actually pass Congress, and it will then be sent to the states for ratification. 26 states will ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. But you need 3/4 of them. And what ends up happening in the 1970s is a counterattack, which was actually led by a conservative women's group led by a woman by the name of Phyllis Schlafly. And what they argued in the 1970s, well, the United States had just left a nasty little old war in Vietnam. One of the things that was most troubling to many people about the Vietnam War, the draft. And so the argument was made, ERA equals draft for women. And that was enough. The remaining states refused to ratify the ERA, and actually several states that had ratified took votes to decertify their ratification. And so to this day, there is not an equal rights amendment in the Constitution. The final example of change that was kind of brought about by this rising voice for women in the early 1920s was an organization known as the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Okay? Now, what this group had sought to do was influence, particularly people way back when they were doing the Treaty of Versailles, to voice things like there should be no imperialism, there should be no militarism, and so this group, obviously from its name, it's concerned with international issues, and they're looking, in effect, well, for that thing, world peace. But what ends up happening to the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom is that they become yet another victim of the Red Scare. Because it will be shown, it will be uncovered, that many of the members of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom were socialists. So what type of organization is this anyway? A commie one. What eventually happens to this powerful women's movement that kind of began in the early 1920s is that the two main political parties figure out that women did not vote anymore. That other factors had a tendency to affect how women voted, perhaps even more than gender. These factors were race, ethnicity, class, geography. And when politicians kind of discovered there was not this political atomic bomb known as the women's vote, they back away from reform. Now, as far as then versus now, there's still, all women do not vote the same way to this day. But today there is one party that is, that more women vote for, okay? And so, interestingly enough, that party which more women vote for is a party that has a larger voice calling for protection of women's rights. Interestingly enough, conversely, there is another party that women vote less for. But interestingly enough, men vote for it more. Okay? Speaking of that party, in the 1920s, we are going to see a re-emergence, even though they had not been gone for very long, a re-emergence of the powerful Republican Party. It begins in the election of 1920. Now, in 1920, the Democrats are going to try, well, hey, it works for the Republicans, let's go for someone from Ohio. So the Democrats are going to run the governor of Ohio, a guy by the name of James Cox. Now, interesting enough, on this ticket, a little bit further down the ticket, well, one down the ticket, is someone we might recognize. Running for vice president is a guy by the name of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Okay. Now, Roosevelt is more at the beginning of his career here. He had served in Wilson's administration as the Assistant Secretary to the Navy. Same job cousin had had. Okay? And Roosevelt had actually gone with Wilson to Paris. And so it's my belief that this is where FDR develops his foreign policy views. And when we meet FDR at the end of this unit, we're going to see that his foreign policy is very, 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 very much like Wilson's. As simple as this. League of Nations, me, United Nations. Okay? What Cox and Roosevelt are going to run on is the idea that the League of Nations needs to include the United States, and it needs to have that attack on one is an attack on all thing. So if you believe, like they do, that Wilson had the right idea, that they could bring about world peace in this way, vote for Cox and Roosevelt. Additionally, Cox and Roosevelt will say that we need to restore the progressivism that we had been practicing before the war. We kind of stepped away from it a little bit because we were now in a war country. We're not war country anymore. So hey, let's get back to regulating big business. Let's get back to protecting workers' rights. Let's get back to it. Come on. So Cox and Roosevelt. Progressivism, Treaty of Versailles. Well, the Republicans, okay? The Republicans had been split, right? Back in 1912. They had started to mend fences in 1916. And in 1919, that entire wing, that progressive wing of the party, which had been represented kind of by Theodore Roosevelt, we don't have to worry about Theodore Roosevelt anymore because Theodore Roosevelt is dead. Okay? And he did not go, I'm sure he would have wanted to be like eaten by a bear or something like that. No, he goes peacefully in his sleep. Okay? Some people say that that's the only way death could get him. Anyway. So with Roosevelt and the progressive wing essentially silenced, we have this convention in Chicago. Okay? And the convention's supposed to choose who's going to be the candidate for the Republican Party. But across the street from the convention hall was the Blackstone Hotel. And in room 404, we even know the room. In room 404 of the Blackstone Hotel, the fat cats of the Republican Party, the industrialists, the big bosses, okay? They're all up there in a meeting, okay? It was literally a room, it was a smoke-filled room, where they were going, all right, so, who do you think we should choose for president? Okay? And they decide that this senator, who had kind of made a name for himself, blocking the Treaty of Versailles, okay, a guy by the name of Warren Gamil Harding. That's our guy. This guy is pro-business, okay? He's likable. In fact, that's his best attribute. He's the guy you wanted to hang out with. He was the guy you were going to invite to your party, okay? I mean, he's that guy. But he isn't so sharp.
he's not so bright or anything like that, that he's going to turn around and be some big progressive reformer in disguise. Okay? Harding is just is. So Harding is chosen by the kind of the fat cats of the party. And suddenly, down in the convention hall where they were having, trying to figure out who we're gonna get, all of a sudden message comes in, Warren Gamil Harding. And after we go, Warren Gamil who? Oh, that guy. Name goes out, Warren Gamil Harding. And Warren Gamil Harding gets the nomination. To give the ticket a little bit more weight, they put that folk hero who had crushed the Boston police strike, Calvin Coolidge, on the ticket too. Okay. Note this is a 0 year, people. I told you about the 0 factor, right? Oh? 0 presidents do not survive. Okay. Anyway, what the Republicans are going to run on is basically A, a return to kind of a pro-business thing, and B, simply a return to normalcy. Do we want to go gallivanting around the globe trying to save the world? No, that's not normal. Do we want to go like regulating every single aspect of American business and slow down the economy? No, that's not normal. Okay? You know, this progressive thing has run its course. It's time to return to normalcy. And with women voting for the very first time constitutionally, Warren Gamil Harding becomes President of the United States. Harding. Sweep. Solid South, but even the Solid South not even as solid. Tennessee, they figured out that Lincoln might be dead. Wish I could say on his birthday. Shame on. So the Harding administration, basically, Harding, not so notable, but there was one kind of superstar in his cabinet. The superstar in his cabinet was the Commerce Secretary, Herbert Hoover. Now, Herbert Hoover was someone who kind of liked progressive reform, kind of liked it, but he did not like that the government was given so much power, that the government was doing all this regulating, that the government was so active. So what Herbert Hoover does is he comes up with this concept that we call the associated state, where rather than government coming in and saying, I'm going to regulate you, I'm going to bust your trust, okay? What Hoover does is says, you know I have the power to regulate you, you know. So what would you do, you know, on your own to be just like a better corporate citizen in the world? Come on, what would you do? And the idea was to basically get business to do voluntarily what Roosevelt was making them do by force. Hey, you know, your product, it kills people, so come on. Can't you just make so fewer people die? Thanks. Thanks. Okay. Now, basically, business gains huge influence during this time period. The power of big business now goes up like a rocket as the regulating power of the United States government is diminished. Harding's administration is also known for scandal. Everybody seemed to be getting paid off by somebody else. Now, there's a whole bunch of scandals. I'm going to give you one exemplar. Okay? The exemplar scandal, the one you should ought to know, is known as the Teapot Dome scandal. Now, basically, it's a little bit complicated, but here the United States government had decided to set aside oil for the United States Navy. You know, if there's a war, doesn't the Navy need oil? Of course it does. So, they had set aside some oil for the United States Navy. Well, the Secretary of the Interior, I know it's a weird name, it means the guy who's in charge of all public land, will approach the Secretary of the Navy, and he's going to say to the Secretary of the Navy, oil wells, Navy, doesn't make sense. I mean, this one's in Wyoming. I'll tell you what, Secretary of the Navy, why don't you sign control of the oil wells over to the Interior Department and we'll manage them for you. And the Secretary of the Navy says, oh, really? Thanks, golly. And he signs control of those oil wells over to the Department of the Interior. Well, Albert Fall, rather than just simply managing these oil wells, he will receive a $350,000 payment fraud. He will then lease the control of these oil wells to a California oil guy by the name of Doheny. If you know, over in Beverly Hills, Doheny Drive, the Doheny Mansion, that's Doheny. Anyway, so basically, if you now are leasing these oil wells, what can you now do? Sell the oil. And so Doheny now starts pumping the public oil and selling it to the public. And he makes dumb money. Anyway, when these scandals come to light, they're not able to prove that Doheny made the bribe, but they are able to prove that Fall took the bribe. And basically, the only person who truly gets any sort of punishment for any of the scandals that happens during Harding's term is going to be Albert Fall. He's the fall guy. He takes the fall. And that is exactly where the phrase comes from.
Really?
That is exactly where the phrase comes from. Okay? He takes the fall. Anyway, Harding manages to be blissfully unaware of all of these scandals. And before they really come out and get him, he dies. Now, he had a heart attack. But there are those who suspect that what actually caused his heart attack was that his wife poisoned him. Okay? Because you see, Harding, there's another scandal. Okay? And this time, it's a scandal more befitting a Democrat, but it's a Republican this time. Remember he likes to have fun? Yeah, he likes to have all sorts of fun. And so there was an accusation that he had fathered a child in a White House cloakroom. Okay? Yeah, maybe wife not so happy. Okay? This will make John Calvin Coolidge, don't worry about the quote. This will make John Calvin Coolidge President of the United States. Now, Calvin Coolidge is basically known for his honesty, his morality, his industry, his frugality, his frugality, his frugality, his frugality, his frugality, and his frugality. And in case you didn't get it, he doesn't like to spend money. Okay, doesn't like to spend his money. He doesn't like to spend the government's money. He would, if he had the power, he would unspend your money for you. Okay? Now, the knock on Calvin Coolidge is that as President of the United States, he did not do very much. Well, Calvin Coolidge is my dad's favorite president. And when you ask him about Calvin Coolidge, he's going to say, well, that's exactly the point. He didn't do very much because he's a conservative. He doesn't want to. So he did exactly as much as he wanted to do. And this is the type of government my dad likes. My dad likes government that doesn't do things, okay? Because when government does things, it spends his money, okay? Anyway, Calvin Coolidge is pro-business. He is also, remember dollar diplomacy? I told you about it under Taft, okay? Give dollar diplomacy a steroid injection, okay? And that is what Calvin Coolidge does. He is going to encourage American investment globally. Next, he's in favor of big tariffs. You see, he believes that the business of the American people is business. They are profoundly concerned with producing, buying, selling, investing, and prospering in the world. I am strongly of the opinion that the great majority of the of the people will always find this these the moving impulses of our life. In other words, business. America, business. So you remember William McKinley, trickle down? Okay? Yeah. So just think of trickle down, steroid injection. Think of dollar diplomacy, steroid injection. Think of anything. Think of tariffs, give it a steroid injection. If it helps business, Calvin Coolidge is for it. This disturbing political cartoon shows Calvin Coolidge playing the saxophone, even before Bill Clinton, while big business dances along. This, however, is my favorite Calvin Coolidge political cartoon, if indeed you can have a favorite Calvin Coolidge political cartoon. Who gets it? Stare at it a moment before you shout anything out. Who gets it? What's that?
Do you trim the bear?
Bear. Why a bear? I don't get it. Why a bear?
Teddy?
And what did Teddy believe in?
It's trim when I say Teddy believes in. Oh yeah, right, progressive.
He's progressive, which means, was he big government?
He was big government.
He's big government. So if Teddy, the teddy bear, is big government, Calvin Coolidge is trim wherever you can. Calvin Coolidge trims Teddy. All right? An example of the trimmings, as it were. The McNary-Haugen Dome. Now, during World War I, do you remember what was that thing? What was that responsibility that the United States had during the war? We were supposed to do what?
Grow food.
Grow food. And so the American farmer, American farmer grew stuff. Grow, 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 plant, 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 grow, 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 plant, 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 grow, grow, grow. American farmer is in their element. Farming, growing, selling. Awesome! Okay, but when the war is over and they clean up all the landmines and barbed wire and all that stuff in Europe, what can Europeans start finally doing for themselves? Planting their own stuff. And so, do the Europeans need all the American food anymore? No, they don't. Yet, what are the American farmers happily still doing? Growing, 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 planting, 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 growing, 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 and planting, planting, planting. We started growing too much, planting too much, and now we are not making any money anymore. And so the farmers say, government help! I can't stop! I can't get off my plow. And so they ask the government to intervene. And so in Congress they pass a law, or pardon me, a bill, known as the McNary-Haugen bill. And what McNary-Haugen would do is that all of that excess stuff that the farmers grow, well, the United States government will simply buy it up, okay? And then like go sell it in Europe for whatever they can get, probably a loss. You are Mr. Trim wherever you can, Calvin Coolidge. How you feeling about McNary-Haugen? Pouring money in to buy something and selling it as a loss, does that sound like trim wherever you can? And so Calvin Coolidge vetoes it. 2 years later, McNary and Haugen try and pass the law again. And Calvin Coolidge says, did I stutter? And he vetoes it again. Okay. Passed twice, vetoes twice. Okay. Might be something that Mr. Obama's going to have to start studying. All right, so very quickly, why don't you write down for me, how were the economic policies of the 1920s different from those of the Progressive era? Why don't you turn to your neighbor? So many people are absent. I was going to have you find a new person, but it might not be a good thing to do. So turn to your neighbor and just tell them one difference. Okay. Okay, got quiet real quick. So you must find your differences quickly. So what's one difference? What's one difference? Going back to home desk, back to home desk, back to home desk, back to home desk, back to home desk. Yeah. All right. what's one big difference between progressive era and 20s policy? There's no differences, Mr. King. They are exactly the same. I don't know what you're talking about. Thank you.
There was little to no regulation of businesses. It was voluntary.
It was voluntary. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Okay. Second, you were going to say something, or?
Oh, I was going to say that during the progressive era, very things are changing on policies, moving forward. But in the 1920s, it was
Yeah, more status quo. Okay. Nice. So it's 1924, and Republicans. Now, even though Calvin Coolidge is an accidental president, what do you think the big business fat cats of the Republican Party are going to say in 1924? We like you. We really, really like you. And so, in 1924, the Republicans are going to run Calvin Coolidge with the "you could have made it up" slogan, "Keep cool with Coolidge." Now, this is going to make the old progressive wing of the Republican Party sad. And saddest among those old progressives was good old Fighting Bob LaFollette. Remember old Fighting Bob, the Wisconsin idea? Okay, we can change everything, more democracy. Fighting Bob LaFollette. Okay, so Fighting Bob LaFollette is going to say, no, let's bring back progressivism. Let's bring back the Bull Moose Party. Let's bring back the Progressive Party. Hooray, progressivism. Do you remember? Do you remember progressivism, people? Guess what?
No one remembers.
No one outside of Wisconsin really cared. Yeah.
Wait, this dude with Follett, you guys kind of read them, was referendum when everyone can vote on a law?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it was a state thing.
Wait, what was it called where everyone can vote for, like
Oh, to take the president out, or pardon me,
no, not take out, like
put in as just a vote. Oh, you mean that? You mean the direct primary?
yeah.
The Democrats, however, in this election, it was really messy. Really, really messy. They were divided on everything. Let me count the ways they were divided. They are divided on the issue of prohibition. They are divided urbanites versus farmers. They are divided fundamentalists versus modernists. They are divided northern liberals, southern conservative. They are divided immigrants and old stock Americans. In other words, did I mention how divided they were? Now, there was this guy, and he's actually known around here. You know him. You don't even know you know him. Okay? There's a beach, and there's a park. Will Rogers. Okay? Well, Will Rogers was kind of the Jon Stewart of his day. And he's the one who used to make that quip, that joke about politics. And what he said once is, I do not belong to an organized political party. I'm a Democrat. All right? Basically, in 1924, it took the Democratic Party 102 separate ballots to choose their candidate. I mean, can you just imagine that, being at that convention, and 101 times you say, let's put it to a vote, and 101 times you do not reach the 2/3 majority necessary to nominate someone from your party? Have you stuck a fork in your eye yet? Okay? One of the main problems was the insurgency of a guy by the name of William McAdoo. Now, William McAdoo was Woodrow Wilson's son-in-law, and he was being openly backed by the Ku Klux Klan. Okay? And so basically within the Democratic Convention, they are combating a candidate who's openly associating themselves with the Klan. And it took 102 ballots to successfully defeat him. They end up nominating a conservative New York banker by the name of John W. Davis. But the progressive wing of the party went screaming, "Ah, what about us?" And so, for vice president, they nominate William Jennings Bryan's younger brother, Charles, to become the candidate for VP. Okay? Next, they start to create, or try to create, the platform for the Democratic Party in 1924. Now, Northern liberals and progressives are saying things like, we would like to propose that the Democratic Party endorse a federal anti-lynching law. And the convention, no. They were not able to endorse a federal anti-lynching law. So then the Northern liberals go, okay, how about we condemn the terrorist practices of the KKK? Anyone? Come on, guys! Really? No. In 1924, the Democratic Party could neither call for a federal anti-lynching law, nor condemn the KKK. Well, in the general election, Coolidge wins decisively. The why? The economy. There had been a recession right after the war, as we had transitioned out of a war economy into a peacetime economy. And when that recession was over, the United States economy took off like gangbusters. And who's there to take credit for it? Calvin Coolidge. The people in Wisconsin voted for him.
Jeez.
And Solid South.
That's really adorable.
So now, just to start, we'll do a little taste here. We'll mainly talk about this next time, but the 1920s is the beginning of what we call the culture wars. And what helps create this division in America is largely urbanization. The rapid population growth in the cities. And in these cities, what you get is oftentimes a huge mixes of people, oftentimes from other countries, immigrants. And what people in the cities started to do is they developed a lifestyle that was vastly, dramatically different than what people did in small towns. And basically what ends up happening is small town folks start looking at these urban lifestyles, and they're basically kind of saying, that's not America. That's not America. And what ends up happening is if you start to see people doing something different, you perceive it as a threat. And if you perceive it as a threat, you need to do something about it. And so what ends up happening is we get this contest developing, where one group basically calls themselves the future, the modern, the change. And the other group says that they are protecting American values. Does that sound at all familiar? The first front of the culture wars is prohibition. Now, interestingly enough, whether or not it's practiced or not, politically you took a side here. Whether you believed in it or not, you took a side. And basically what we saw was that even though the 18th Amendment is ratified in most states, because it had to be in order for it to be ratified, if you took a closer look, what you're going to see is that the cities were not no, they were hell no. Okay? The cities did not want this thing. And so, what ends up happening is you could basically say, are you in favor, are you against prohibition? If you're in the city, people are saying no. If they were in the countryside, they said yes. Now, Will Rogers, our Jon Stewart of the day, used to say this, however. Mississippians would vote in favor of prohibition so long as they could stagger to the polls. Get it? When next we meet, we'll touch on what exactly happened in prohibition. I think you kind of get it, but we'll talk about it briefly. Think of, if you're reading The Great Gatsby right now, about what all those people were doing during Gatsby times, and whether or not, wait, that's prohibition time? Really? Really?